Welcome back, everybody. We are back. A brand new book of the Bible, the book of Job. We just finished the book of Esther, and I'm excited to start the book of Job. I think there's a lot of good stuff in here that we're going to be able to kind of take out of there, use for ourselves, challenge ourselves. So I am excited. Now, I have been kind of doing one chapter at a time up to this point, with a couple of exceptions, but for the book of Job, I'm going to structure it a little bit differently. I'm going to kind of clump some chapters together, and it'll help me with kind of articulating the dialogue with some of the back and forth conversations. But anyhow, so today we're basically going to do the first couple of chapters in the book of Job. And some people say the book of Job, it's a little bit more challenging. It's harder to kind of go through. It seems like a job. I'm sorry. You see what I did there? Because Job and Job are okay. Anyhow, so it is challenging, but I think it's going to be challenging for us in a good way. And it's one of the most fascinating and challenging books, perhaps, in the entire Bible. It sort of makes us wrestle with the idea or the question of, like, why do good people suffer? Why do good people have bad things happen to them? And I know I've asked that question before. I know you've probably asked that question before. But right from the beginning of Job, we are introduced to Job, the man who had everything and then he lost it all, and we're going to see how he handled that. So, starting off in the book of Job, verse 1, it says this: There once was a man named Job who lived in the land of Uz. He was blameless, a man of complete integrity. He feared God, he stayed away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 teams of oxen, 300 female donkeys, and he also had many servants. He was, in fact, the richest person in the entire area. So that's quite the kickoff, quite the description if you're talking about somebody. He was the richest person in the entire area. He was a man of integrity and he stayed away from evil. So Job wasn't just a good man, he was deeply devoted to God. And he was blessed with sons, with daughters, with animals, with servants, with immense wealth. Job's true character shows in a very small detail that probably a lot of people overlook. It's in verse 5, and it says this: When the celebrations ended, sometimes after several days, Job would purify his children. He would get up early in the morning and offer a burnt offering for each of them. For Job said to himself, Perhaps my children have sinned and have cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular practice. So Job wasn't just religious, he was legitimately concerned about the spiritual well being of his family. After the celebrations were over, he would go out and he would offer these burnt sacrifices for his kids in case they had sinned or cursed God in their hearts, and this was his regular practice. And I just think that speaks volumes for who Job was and what his character looked like. So then in verse 6, the scene sort of shifts to a heavenly courtroom. The adversary, Satan, he appears before God. God points out Job to Satan, and in verse 8 he says this about Job. The Lord asked Satan, Have you noticed my servant Job? He is the finest man in all the earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil. But how does Satan respond to this? Satan decides he's going to challenge Job's faith. He essentially says, Yeah, Job only really loves you because you bless him, because of all the things that you've given him. So then Satan makes this accusation in verse 11. He says, But reach out and take away everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. In other words, Satan is saying, take away all his blessings and his faith will disappear. So God says, challenge accepted. God allows Satan to test Job, but with certain limits, certain parameters around that. And in one devastating day, Job loses everything. One messenger after another arrives with terrible news. His livestock are stolen, his servants are killed, and then the worst message of all: a powerful wind collapses the house where his children were gathered, killing all 10 of them. So in a single day, Job's world is completely shattered. So if you're Job, you just got one message after another and you just have all this bad news. You're saying, when it rains, it pours. Am I right? Everything he has is falling apart. How does Job respond to this? I can tell you honestly how I would probably respond to this, and it's not the same way Job did. In verse 21, Job says this. He said, I came naked from my mother's womb, and I will be naked when I leave. The Lord gave me what I had, and the Lord has taken it away. Praise the name of the Lord. Like, good on you, Job. We may never know how we will respond to tragedy until we are forced to face it. Job chose to worship God even in this moment of devastation, in this moment of big grief. He chose to praise God even after great loss. When you and I suffer a loss, whether it's possessions or someone that we love, praising God for his sovereignty and generosity in allowing us to have those things for a season in our lives, for a time in our lives, is usually the last thing that we want to do. But Job shows us that that is the proper response to God. So chapter 1 finishes with this in verse 22. In all of this Job did not sin by blaming God. So chapter 2 kicks off with Satan sort of reappearing at this heavenly court, and he argues that Job has only stayed faithful because his health was untouched. Yeah, he lost all his stuff. Yeah, he lost all his kids, all his family, all his servants. But he himself is healthy, and that's really the only reason that he is staying faithful. So Satan is allowed to strike Job physically, and Job is afflicted with these painful sores from head to toe. He sits in ashes, scraping his skin with broken pottery. And even Job's wife in verse 9 says, "Are you still trying to maintain your integrity? Curse God and die." And it's one thing to lose our personal comforts, our health, these things, but it is something entirely different when you lose the support of your spouse. And she tells Job to curse God and die. But Job responds to her in verse 10 by saying, "You talk like a foolish woman. Should we accept only good things from the hand of God and never anything bad?" So in all of this, Job said nothing wrong. Let's go, man. Job is literally the man. That's all I can say. And then towards the end of chapter 2, we see three of Job's friends sort of arrive to comfort Job. And when they see Job, they barely recognize him because of all the sores all over his body. They sit with him in silence for 7 days and 7 nights. In verse 13, it says, "For they saw his suffering was too great for words." And I think it's important to note here that sometimes the best comfort is simply just being present. I know oftentimes when you're trying to comfort someone that's experienced great loss, great tragedy, you oftentimes can't find the right words to say. Maybe they don't need words in that moment. Maybe they just need you to come and be present in their situation. So that is where chapter 2 ends, and that's how I'm going to wrap up this particular video. What are the lessons from these first two chapters that we saw about Job? First, our faith is tested in the midst of a storm. Our faith is not tested when things are going well. Our faith is tested when things are happening to us, tragedies are happening, we're experiencing loss, all this stuff. It's easy to trust God when our life is going well, but real faith shows up when everything seems to be falling apart. And I love how Job didn't his worship didn't depend on his circumstances or how wealthy he was or even how healthy he was. He chose to worship God despite those things, and I think that shows a great amount of faith. Second thing that I saw here is that you and I don't see the whole story sometimes. When things are happening to us, we don't see the whole story. We see what our eyes allow us to see. And for Job, from his perspective, he had no idea about this conversation that was happening in heaven between God and Satan. From his perspective, all of this stuff just seemed random. And behind the scenes, what he didn't know was something bigger was unfolding. And I think for us, many times in our lives, we might be living in chapter 2 of Job when God is still writing chapter 42, which is the last chapter of Job. So hang in there because God is not finished with you yet. Last but not least, character, our character. It matters more than our comfort. God did not praise Job because he had a ridiculous amount of money or any other sort of wealth. He didn't praise Job because of the possessions that he had. He praised Job for his character. He called him out as a man of great integrity, and integrity is who you are even when life stops being fair. So, the question that I have for us today is this: what kind of faith do we really have when our blessings disappear? Does it disappear, or are we still willing to say, "God, praise the name of the Lord"? We have to ask ourselves, do we love God for who He is, for what He has done, or for what He gives us? Two very different things. So, if everything we relied on was suddenly taken away, would our faith still stand? So, I'm excited to get through the book of Job. The story of Job reminds me that suffering doesn't always mean I'm being punished for something. It doesn't always mean it's because I've done X, Y, or Z. Now I'm having to suffer the consequences. Sometimes it just simply means that there's a bigger story unfolding that I can't see yet. And the challenge in that is that I have to trust God even in those seasons of difficulty. But if God can sustain Job through his unimaginable loss, then surely he can sustain me through whatever storm I go through. Because when God starts writing a story, there's no amount of suffering that can stop the ending that he has planned for you and for me. And when God restores, redeems, and proves his faithfulness in the end, won't he do it?